Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns that we could never predict. One of those twists happened to me that evening when we met in that bar. I never thought I was capable of something like this, something that would change not only me, but everyone around me. I didn't know that meeting would mark the beginning of something so thrilling, so unpredictable. And I didn't know I'd find myself at the center of events that would make me reflect on my desires, dreams, and who I really am. It was like a flash of light in complete darkness. And, as it turned out, I didn't even know what I truly wanted. That evening, Michael and I finally decided to go out for dinner. After weeks of hard work, he needed some kind of break. As usual, he was engrossed in his phone, checking messages and sending emails. I had gotten used to his constant busyness, but this time I wanted something different. I wanted to feel like we were still together, that our marriage wasn't just an arrangement, but something more. The bar Michael had chosen was impressive. With panoramic windows overlooking the city, the bright lights of skyscrapers reflected in the glass, creating an atmosphere of mystery and magic. Music played softly in the background, and it seemed like the perfect place to relax and talk. But soon, I realized that the evening would not be at all what I had imagined. "I invited Chris to join us," Michael said suddenly, not looking up from his phone. "He's only in town for a few days. I haven't seen him in ages." I sighed inwardly. Chris, Michael's best friend from college. We'd met a few times, and I'd always found him pleasant, but nothing more. "Sure, let him come," I replied, trying not to show my disappointment. I had hoped for a quiet evening together, but now I had to share Michael's attention with his friend. A few minutes later, the door to the bar opened, and Chris walked in. Tall, with dark hair and a slight stubble, he immediately drew the attention of several women in the room. His confident stride and friendly smile created a sense of ease and calm. He approached us with a broad smile and hugged Michael. "Laura, always a pleasure to see you," he said, turning to me. His voice was warm and friendly, but I noticed something new in his eyes, something I hadn't seen before. A spark, a vague excitement. I felt a slight tension in my chest and forced myself to smile in return. "And I'm glad to see you too, Chris," I said, trying to stay casual. "So, what are we drinking?" Michael asked, finally looking up from his phone and glancing at both of us. Chris smirked and sat down beside me. "I'm thinking a cocktail, something refreshing maybe. Laura, what about you?" "Perhaps a glass of white wine," I answered. Michael raised his hand to call the waiter. "2 cocktails and a glass of white wine, please," he said, then returned to discussing his latest contract. Meanwhile, Chris continued to look at me, his eyes filled with curiosity. "Laura, how have you been? Michael talks about work all the time, but I want to hear about you." I smiled, trying not to show how my heart had started to beat a little faster. "Well, work, home, the usual routine." Chris laughed. "Oh, come on, you. Stuck in a routine? I don't believe it. With a spirit like yours, you must be up to something exciting." I felt my cheeks grow warm. "Well, you're exaggerating, Chris. But thank you for the compliment." Michael, as always, seemed oblivious to our conversation. He was too absorbed in his work. "Hey, Mike, do you really have to keep your phone out even at dinner?" Chris teased. "I thought we came here to relax." Michael chuckled and slipped his phone into his pocket. All right. Sorry, guys. It's just work. You know how it is." "Don't worry." Chris smiled and turned back to me. "Laura, do you like to dance?" I looked at him, surprised. "Well, yes, sometimes." "Why?" "Then why don't we dance?" he suggested, extending his hand to me. I felt a sudden rush of excitement. "Right now?" "Yes, right now," Chris insisted. "Let's have some fun." I glanced at Michael, who just shrugged. "Go ahead, have fun," he said with a smile. "I don't mind." I stood up, feeling a slight tremor in my hands, and allowed Chris to lead me to the dance floor. The music had changed to a slower melody, and we began to move to the rhythm. I felt his hand on my waist, and the space between us grew smaller. "You look beautiful tonight," he whispered in my ear, and something inside me trembled. "Thank you," I replied, trying not to reveal my nervousness. "But it's just the dress." "It's not the dress," he added softly. "It's how you look in it." We continued to dance, and I could feel the tension between us growing. My mind was telling me to stop, but my body seemed to have a mind of its own. When the music ended, we returned to the table. Michael was already waiting for us with a new cocktail in hand. "Did you have fun?" he asked with a light smile. "Huh, a lot," Chris replied, casting a brief glance at me. "Laura is a great dancer." Michael laughed. "That's good. I'm glad you two are getting along." I sat at the table, trying to gather my thoughts. Something was happening between Chris and me, and I couldn't quite understand what. But I knew one thing. This evening was just the beginning of something much bigger. A week had passed since that evening in the bar, yet thoughts of Chris wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to focus on work, on household tasks, but it was all in vain. The image of his smile, the warmth in his gaze, and the light touch we shared while dancing kept resurfacing in my thoughts. I couldn't understand what was happening to me. It was as if someone had turned on a light inside me, illuminating feelings and thoughts that had long remained in the dark. I found myself absent-mindedly scrolling through his social media profile, looking at photos, trying to figure out what it was about him that made me think of him more often than I should. There he was, on the beach with friends, smiling at a cafe, holding a glass of wine and laughing. I felt a strange yet pleasant warmth spreading in my chest. Perhaps it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, I tried to convince myself. But at the same time, I knew there was more to it. Something kept drawing me to every detail of his life. "Laura, where are you?" Michael's voice broke through my thoughts. I looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. "You've been staring into space for 10 minutes. Is something wrong?" "No, nothing," I replied, forcing a smile. "I was just lost in thought." Michael sat down next to me, curiously peering into my eyes. "You seem distracted," he noted, raising an eyebrow slightly. "You know, I was thinking we should do something to unwind a bit. By the way, I've arranged to meet up with Chris this evening. He's in a great mood after that night. Maybe you'd like to join us." I felt my heart stop for a moment and then start racing. "You want me to come with you?" I asked, hoping my voice didn't betray my nervousness. "Yes, of course," Michael exclaimed. "It'll be fun. We're going to celebrate the closing of my new deal. Chris suggested spending the evening at a client's country estate. It'll be a small private party, nothing formal." "Sounds interesting." I tried to keep my voice calm. "I think I can go." But inside, my mind was in turmoil. As soon as Michael left the room, a whirlwind of thoughts began spinning. I would see Chris again. What would it mean? How should I act to avoid revealing my feelings? These questions wouldn't leave me alone as I prepared for the evening. The estate where we arrived was stunning. Enormous windows, elegant columns, marble staircases. It looked like something out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. There were people everywhere, soft music played in the background, and the air was filled with the scents of fresh flowers and gourmet dishes. Chris greeted us at the entrance with a wide smile. "Glad you could make it." He kissed me on the cheek, which felt unexpected and even a little unsettling. "Beautiful house," I said, trying to hide my emotions. "You always know how to pick a place." Chris winked at me. "It's not my house, but I know how to find a good party," he replied with a light laugh. Michael quickly disappeared into the crowd, spotting some familiar faces, leaving Chris and me standing together. "Come on, I want to show you something," he suggested, and I agreed. We walked through the main hall, where guests were dancing, and stepped out onto a small terrace with a breathtaking view of the night sky filled with stars. I breathed in the cool air and felt a sense of calm wash over me. It was quiet here, and I suddenly realized how much I had missed this kind of peace. Beautiful, isn't it? Chris asked, standing beside me. Sometimes you just need to step away from it all and enjoy the moment. I nodded. Yes, it's lovely here. I like places like this. They give you time to think. Chris looked at me. And what are you thinking about, Laura? His question caught me off guard. I. I'm not sure, I muttered. A lot of things. Life, work, how much everything has changed over the past few years. He listened intently, and I felt the tension between us building. And what has changed? He asked softly. I sighed, trying to find the right words. I feel like I've gotten lost. In the routine, the monotony. Sometimes I'm not sure I'm really living my life. Chris looked at me thoughtfully, a slight smile on his lips. You're not the only one who feels that way. I've been through it myself. Sometimes it feels like everything's just standing still. His words struck a chord within me. And what did you do? I decided to take a risk and make a change, he said simply. Maybe you're on the verge of something new too? His words stirred a mix of emotions within me. You think I'm on the verge of a change? I don't know, Chris smiled. But you seem like someone searching for answers. I lowered my eyes, trying to hide my embarrassment. Maybe. Chris took a step closer, and I felt my heart start to race again. Laura, don't be afraid of your feelings. Life's too short to ignore what really matters. I looked up and met his gaze. What do you think matters, Chris? He looked at me with such sincerity that a shiver ran through my body. I think what matters is being honest with yourself, with your desires, your dreams. You think the same, don't you? At that moment, I felt something real between us, something that went beyond mere attraction or flirtation. I knew it was wrong, knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. Chris, I don't know, I whispered, trying not to show my nerves. He took another step closer, leaning in. You do know, he said softly. You're just afraid to admit it. The words hung in the air, and I didn't know what to say next. But one thing was clear. Our feelings for each other had become too obvious to ignore. That evening, the atmosphere in the mansion was becoming more and more lively. Guests laughed, danced, champagne glasses flashing in their hands. Conversations, jokes, and genuine laughter filled the air. I smiled, pretending to be amused by everything around me, but my thoughts were only about Chris. Michael and I were engaged in casual conversation with a couple of acquaintances when Chris came closer. I felt his presence change something in the air. He lightly touched my hand, and I shuddered. Do you want to get some fresh air? He whispered in my ear. His voice was barely audible over the noise of the party, but his words instantly sent a wave of warmth through me. I nodded, feeling my heart start to pound harder. Yes, that would be nice, I replied, trying to sound calm. We slipped past the people and headed to the terrace. It was dark there, only a few soft lights illuminated the space, and the stars shimmered above us. The music was muted, as if only echoes of the melody were reaching us. The terrace was almost empty, and I felt the tension building. Chris stopped and turned to me. You look beautiful tonight, he said, his voice softer than usual. Thank you, I replied, not knowing what to do with my hands. There was something in his gaze that made me feel lost. I felt my knees trembling, and I had to make an effort to stay in place. We stood close, so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. A thought flashed through my mind. What am I doing? But my body seemed to have a life of its own. Chris looked into my eyes. Do you often think about what happened between us? He asked quietly, not breaking his gaze. I couldn't lie. Yes, I admitted. I do. So do I, he said, stepping closer. You know, sometimes there are moments that can't be explained with words. I felt my heart beating faster. Chris, this is wrong, I whispered, though my soul was screaming something completely opposite. Maybe, he replied. leaning slightly closer to my ear. But sometimes what seems wrong is exactly what we need. My thoughts were racing, and before I could say or do anything, he leaned in closer. His lips were so near, I could feel their warmth. I knew I should step back, push him away, but instead, I just closed my eyes. A moment later, I felt his lips on mine. The kiss was soft, barely perceptible, but it pierced me to the core. It felt as though only the two of us remained in the world, under the stars, with music playing somewhere in the distance. My mind told me this was a mistake, but my heart beat in time with his breath. I felt a wave rising inside me, enveloping all my senses. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity passed in that moment. I wanted to pull away, but instead, I moved closer, surrendering to this unbearable attraction. Suddenly, I heard someone opening the terrace door. My gaze darted toward the entrance, and I saw Michael standing in the doorway. He was looking around, clearly not noticing us. I quickly pulled away from Chris, feeling my face flush. My heart was racing, and my breathing became uneven. Michael, I whispered, trying to compose myself. Chris straightened up immediately and smiled as if nothing had happened. "Hey, Mike," he called out cheerfully, as though seeing him for the first time that evening. "We just stepped out for some fresh air." Michael turned and, seeing us, smiled broadly. "Ah, there you are," he said, noticing nothing unusual. "It's so lively inside, I thought I'd lost you in the crowd." "Yes, it's really wonderful here," I said, trying to hide my nervousness. "I just needed to cool down a bit." Michael came closer, his attention fully focused on the party and the guests. "I was starting to think you decided to leave without us," he joked. "No, we're here," Chris replied, nodding. "Just enjoying the evening." Michael nodded and suggested we go back inside. "Let's go. There's so much happening. I'm sure the night is far from over." I reluctantly agreed, feeling my thoughts scatter in different directions. As we returned to the hall, I tried to focus on the conversation, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Something had changed. Something important and perhaps irreversible. We rejoined the others, but I knew that our time on the terrace had left a mark on my heart. It was a moment that couldn't be ignored or forgotten, and that moment would be the beginning of something bigger than I could imagine. Since that moment on the terrace, I couldn't calm down. Every morning, I woke up thinking about what had happened between Chris and me. I felt torn apart. Inside me was everything: guilt, excitement, fear, and a strange but irresistible feeling of the unknown. My mind screamed that it was a mistake, that I was jeopardizing my marriage, my life. But my heart was beating in a way it hadn't for years. I tried to avoid Chris. His name on my phone screen made my heart skip a beat. I didn't respond to his messages, didn't pick up when he called. I thought that if I could distance myself from him, it would all fade away like a silly dream. But forgetting him turned out to be harder than I had expected. One evening, just as I was about to go to bed, the phone rang again. It was Chris. I stared at the screen, wondering whether to answer, but something inside me pushed me toward it. "Hello?" I whispered, as if afraid someone might overhear us. "Laura, it's me. We need to talk." His voice was soft, but insistent. I closed my eyes, trying to keep my composure. "Chris, I don't think this is a good idea." "Listen," he continued. "I know how you feel. I feel it too. But we can't just ignore what happened." "That was a mistake," I interrupted, trying to convince myself more than him. "We need to stop this before it's too late." "But what if I don't want to stop?" His words sounded like a challenge. "Give me one chance, Laura. Let's meet and talk." I was silent, weighing the pros and cons. I knew I should say no, that I should put an end to this, but instead, I heard myself saying, "Okay, where and when?" Chris suggested meeting at a cozy cafe by the waterfront, a place he knew. It was secluded enough that no one we knew would see us. I agreed, not quite believing myself. The next day, I arrived at the cafe early. It was a small place with wooden tables and views of the sea. The waves gently rolled along the shore, and a cool breeze carried the fresh scent of salt and seaweed. I chose a table in the corner, away from prying eyes, and sat nervously tapping my fingers on the table. Chris arrived a few minutes later, as confident and calm as always. When he approached the table, I felt my heart start beating faster again. "Hi," he said, sitting across from me. "Thanks for coming." "I don't even know why I came," I admitted, trying not to look him in the eyes. "Chris, this is madness." "Maybe," he replied, leaning in closer. "But don't you want to understand what's happening between us?" I looked at him. His eyes were full of sincerity, and I realized he genuinely wanted this conversation. "Yes, I do," I whispered, "but I'm afraid." "What are you afraid of?" he asked gently. "Your feelings? What they might mean?" I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm afraid of ruining everything. Afraid that this is just a temporary infatuation." "And what if it's not?" he interrupted. "What if it's something more?" I sighed and finally met his gaze. "Are you really willing to risk everything for this?" He nodded. "Yes. And you?" My heart was pounding like crazy, and I felt my hands trembling. I I don't know, Chris. This is too complicated." He took my hand. "Laura, I'm not asking you to make a decision right now. I just want you to know I'm here. I'm willing to take the risk." My hand remained in his, and I felt his warmth. For a moment, all my doubts disappeared. "I'm willing to take the risk too," I whispered, as if afraid my words might change everything. His eyes lit up, and he squeezed my hand a little tighter. "Then let's try," he suggested. "Let's try to understand what these feelings are and where they'll lead us." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of fear and hope. It was a risk, but something deep inside me told me it was worth taking. I knew difficult moments and potential losses awaited us, but in that moment, I decided to listen to my heart, not my mind. "Let's try," I repeated, feeling a slight smile appear on my lips. We continued talking, laughing, and sharing thoughts, and for a moment, the world around us ceased to exist. It was just a meeting in a cafe, but it meant so much more. It was the beginning of something new, unknown, but so enticing. As we left the cafe, I felt my heart grow a little lighter. Maybe I was making a mistake, maybe not. But I knew one thing. I could no longer live in doubt. I had chosen a path, and now I had to follow it to the end. After our meeting at the cafe, I realized that we needed to be more cautious. We both understood that if anyone found out about our feelings, the consequences could be devastating. So, we began to search for places where we could be alone together without drawing attention. The first such place was Chris's house. It was the safest place for us. His apartment was located in one of the modern residential complexes in the city's business district. Chris was independent enough that no one was interested in his personal life, and we rarely encountered neighbors. We tried to meet in the evening when there was no one around. As soon as I crossed the threshold of his apartment, my heart would start beating faster. The interior was simple but cozy. A soft sofa, paintings on the walls, dim lighting. It was a place where we could forget about the outside world and enjoy the moment. One evening, I came to his place after work. Chris opened the door with a smile. "Hi," he said, stepping aside so I could enter. "How was your day?" "Long," I replied, taking off my coat and feeling his gaze linger on me. "But now everything seems easier." He took my hand and led me to the sofa. "I'm glad you're here," he said softly, and I realized that this place had become our little refuge from the world. Another place where we often met was the riverbank. Far from crowded places and popular cafes, it was quiet and peaceful. We would find a bench under an old willow tree and sit, enjoying the sound of the water. Time seemed to stop when we were together. Look how beautiful it is, Chris once said, pointing to the sunset. It's as if the whole universe is smiling at us. I looked at him and smiled in response. I think it knows what we need. We held hands, listening to the gentle splash of the waves. This place was like a breath of fresh air, where I could be myself, without pretending or holding back. We also made time to meet in the park, in secluded spots among the trees. The park was picturesque, with a lake in the center and paths hidden in dense greenery. We chose secluded benches, away from the main avenues. Sometimes I would bring coffee from a nearby cafe, and we would sit for a long time, talking about everything under the sun. I never thought I could be so happy, Chris confessed one day, stroking my hand. Me neither, I replied, feeling my heart warm. With you, I feel alive. These moments were full of joy and lightness. We cherished every moment together, and each of these places became significant to us. But the more time I spent with Chris, the clearer it became that returning to my old life would no longer be simple. Michael began to notice my frequent absences, and my excuses became less and less convincing. I felt the tension growing between Michael and me as he looked at me with increasing suspicion. Laura, you've changed, he said one evening while we were having dinner at home. Is something going on? I put down my fork, trying not to meet his gaze. Just tired, I replied, feeling my heart pound. Work, worries. He shook his head as if he didn't believe it. You know, I can sense when something's wrong. I remained silent, knowing that the more I spoke, the more lies I would have to fabricate. And deep down, I knew that each time I chose Chris, I was drifting further from my old life, with no possibility of return. With Chris, I felt free, happy, and true to myself. But with each passing day, that freedom became increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. I couldn't foresee how it would end, but I understood that there was no turning back. When Chris suggested spending a day out of town, I immediately sensed it would be something special. He said he wanted to show me a place where we could escape from all our worries and just be together. His eyes sparkled with excitement, and I couldn't deny myself this pleasure. I knew it was risky, but something inside me pulled me closer to him. What do you have in mind? I asked with a smile as he met me outside my apartment. It's a surprise, he replied, holding a small bag with fruits and sandwiches. I want this day to be special for us. We drove to the coast along picturesque roads lined with dense forest. An hour later, we arrived at a small harbor, where a rented yacht was already waiting for us. The pristine vessel bobbed on the waves, ready for our journey. I thought a boat trip would be just what we need, Chris said, helping me aboard. No prying eyes, no pressure, just us and the endless ocean. I smiled, feeling a tinge of excitement. I had never been on a yacht in open sea, and the anticipation of the new experience overwhelmed me. We sailed away from the shore, and soon, all that surrounded us was the blue sea and sky stretching to the horizon. Chris took on the role of captain, confidently steering the yacht, while I sat at the bow, watching the waves foam. The fresh sea breeze brushed against my face, and I felt truly free. Each moment felt like an eternity, filled with joy and tranquility. You know, he began, coming closer, here on the water, all our problems seem so distant. Yes, I agreed. It's so quiet and peaceful here. No one knows where we are, and I like that. We settled on the deck, laying out soft blankets. The sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and pink. We talked, laughed, and shared our thoughts and dreams. It felt so natural, so simple, being with him. Chris looked at me, and I saw his gaze deepen. Laura, he said softly, moving closer, I want you to know, you're more to me than just a fling. I felt his words send a shiver through my body. Chris! He lifted his hand and gently touched my face. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to be with you. no matter how or where. I looked at him, and in that moment, all doubts and fears melted away. I knew I had to be with him. Me too, I whispered, my words blending with the sounds of the waves. We sat there, silently, gazing at each other. Chris leaned in, and our lips met again in a kiss filled with everything we couldn't say with words. It was a moment when I realized that my attraction to him was not just physical, but emotional. He had become more to me than just a lover. Soon, our kisses grew more urgent, and our touches more profound. He gently ran his hands over my shoulders, as if afraid of breaking this fragile moment. I felt his warmth, his breath, and every cell of my body responded in kind. We spent our first night together on the yacht, under the starry sky, in the open sea, far from the world. It was a time when we could forget everything and just be ourselves. We belonged only to each other, and that moment stayed in my heart forever. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I saw was his calm, happy face. We were lying on a soft blanket under the open sky, and the sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon. I felt his hand on my waist and knew that this moment was one of those unforgettable ones. "Good morning," he whispered, smiling. "Good morning," I replied, feeling a light shiver run through me. We didn't speak much. Words were unnecessary. We simply enjoyed being together, allowing ourselves to be happy, even if just for this moment. That day marked the beginning of something greater than we could have ever imagined. After that day on the yacht, I realized that our meetings with Chris had become too risky. My heart was torn in pieces. On one hand, I felt a happiness I hadn't experienced in a long time, but on the other hand, I knew I had to be more careful. Each of our meetings felt like playing with fire, and I feared that sooner or later, we would get burned. I decided to cut back on our interactions, trying to write and respond to messages less frequently. But Chris didn't give up. His messages were persistent, filled with passion and longing. I could see how he didn't want to back down, how he hoped that this could continue. But I understood that the danger was growing, and I couldn't afford to take such risks. One evening, while I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, I heard the notification sound from my phone. It was my personal phone, lying on the couch in the living room. Michael, who was nearby, picked it up and glanced at the screen. I didn't see his face, but I immediately knew something was wrong. His eyes narrowed and his expression changed. He had seen a message from Chris. Michael held my phone in his hands, looking at the screen where Chris's message appeared. He knew it was strange to check his wife's phone, but the notification had caught his attention. He had no reason to doubt her before, but lately I seemed distant, lost in my thoughts. I was often away from home, and my explanations were becoming less convincing. He couldn't resist the temptation to read the message. "You were incredible, Laura. Can I see you again? I can't stop thinking about you." Michael's heart raced. He read the message again, not believing his eyes. A chill ran down Michael's spine. Chris, his best friend. This person, whom he trusted more than anyone, was sending such messages to his wife. Thoughts whirled in his mind. Could this be a misunderstanding? He wondered. But his intuition told him otherwise. He felt a rising wave of suspicion and anger. He put the phone back and pretended nothing had happened, but inside he was boiling. He decided not to tell me anything until he figured out what was really going on. I turned around and saw Michael standing with my phone in his hands. For a moment, I felt a shiver run through me. "Is something wrong?" I asked, trying to keep calm. Michael looked at me, his eyes tense but his face calm. "No, just your phone rang," he said, handing it to me. I took the phone, feeling anxiety welling up inside me. "Thank you," I said, trying not to show my unease. I turned back to the stove but felt his gaze on me. After that incident, I began to notice that Michael was behaving differently. He had become more attentive, asking questions he hadn't asked before. It seemed like he was scrutinizing every action of mine. I knew he suspected something, and it made me feel like I was sitting on a powder keg. But Chris didn't stop sending messages. Each new notification sent a rush of adrenaline and fear through me. Laura, don't avoid me. We can't just end this. I need to see you. These words kept coming back to me in my thoughts. I knew I had to be more decisive, but every time I tried to tell Chris no, my heart refused to obey. That evening, when Michael saw the message, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice. If he finds out, if he realizes what's happening, everything could collapse in an instant. But instead of stopping, it felt like I kept walking the edge, playing with fate. Laura, I've noticed that you've been different lately, Michael said during dinner, his voice calm but with a hint of suspicion. Are you sure everything is okay? I felt my pulse quicken. Yes, everything's fine, I replied, trying to sound as natural as possible. Just a lot of work, that's all. But I knew he wasn't satisfied with my answer. I saw a shadow of doubt in his eyes, and it made me even more anxious. I understood that I couldn't continue lying to him for long. Something had to change. But what? I didn't know. That night, I couldn't sleep. Thoughts swirled in my head, and my heart found no rest. I knew I had to make a decision, but each option seemed terrible. I loved Michael, but Chris had become something important to me, something I couldn't let go of. So, I lay in the darkness, listening to Michael's quiet breathing beside me, and wondered what would come next. After that fateful dinner at the restaurant, I felt like my life was falling apart. Michael wasn't speaking to me, and the house was enveloped in a stifling silence. He slept in the guest room, and every night I would hear him lying awake for hours. Everything that had happened seemed to cast a shadow over our home. I knew that I had led us to this point, and the realization that I had ruined my life was unbearable. I felt as though I was in a fog. Work provided no comfort. Each day felt long and agonizing. I often stared at my phone, hoping for some message from Michael, but he remained silent. Then, after a few days of this silence, I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to try to do something. I couldn't let it all end like this, without making any effort. One evening, when Michael came home from work, I felt that I had to try once more. I approached him and quietly said, "Michael, can we talk?" He looked at me coldly, but nodded. "All right," he replied. "What do you want to say?" We sat in the living room, facing each other. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, trying to stay calm despite the storm of emotions inside me. "Michael," I began, striving to make my voice sound firm. "I am so sorry. I know I've hurt you. I understand that I've ruined everything we had, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix it." He was silent for a long time, staring at a point in front of him before he responded. "Laura, you have no idea how deeply you've betrayed me." I felt tears welling up, but I tried to hold them back. "I know," I whispered. "I truly understand. I'm just asking you to forgive me." Michael looked at me, his eyes filled with pain and disappointment. "Forgiveness?" he echoed, as if the word were foreign to him. "Do you think, Laura, after everything that's happened, that's even possible?" I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him that I still loved him, that all of this was a mistake, that I didn't even understand how things had gotten so bad. But the words wouldn't come. "I don't know what to say," I finally spoke, "but I know that I still love you. You are my husband, my partner, my life, and I understand that losing you would be the biggest mistake of my life." He remained silent for a long time, not looking at me. I saw him struggling with his feelings. It seemed like there was a real battle going on in his soul. "Laura," he finally said softly, "I think I still love you, and maybe I'm willing to forgive you, but I need time." I nodded, not knowing what to say. The words, "I still love you," felt like a ray of hope, but his voice was so sad and weary that I couldn't grasp what he truly felt. "I understand," I replied, reaching out to him. "I'm willing to wait." no matter how long it takes. Michael glanced at my hand, but didn't take it. His eyes shimmered as if he was holding back tears. It won't be easy, he said at last. I'm not sure I can forget everything that happened. I, I understand, I repeated, feeling my heart ache with pain. But please, give me a chance to make things right. I'll do everything I can. He nodded, but didn't reply. We sat in silence, and I felt the weight of our conversation pressing down on both of us. But at the same time, I understood that this was the beginning of something new, perhaps the start of a journey towards healing. We both knew there was a long road ahead, but I was ready to walk it if it meant getting Michael back. A few weeks had passed since the conversation, when Michael said he still loved me and might be willing to forgive. These weeks were the hardest of my life. Every morning I woke up with hope, but each night I went to bed feeling time dragged on endlessly. I tried to be patient, but I couldn't shake the fear that, despite his words, I had already lost him forever. One evening, while I was preparing dinner, Michael walked into the kitchen. I hadn't expected him, as he usually stayed in the living room or went for walks alone. Laura, he began quietly, and I turned around, feeling my heart start racing again. We need to talk. I nodded, trying not to show my anxiety. Of course, I replied, placing the pot on the stove. About what? He took a step closer, sat down at the table, and gestured for me to sit next to him. I felt my legs tremble, but I sat down, meeting his gaze. I've been thinking a lot, he started, his voice steady but with a softness that hadn't been there before. About everything that's happened. About us. I dared not interrupt, though my thoughts were racing in different directions. I can't deny that I feel pain, he continued, but I also can't deny that I love you. I've realized that I don't want to lose what we've built over all these years. Tears welled up in my eyes. Michael, I began, but he raised a hand to stop me from speaking. Wait, let me finish, he said gently. I want to try to start fresh, but only on one condition. What condition? I whispered, feeling my heart almost leap out of my chest. I want us to be honest with each other, like never before, he said. No secrets, no lies. If something's wrong, we talk about it right away. I can't go through this again, Laura. I nodded, feeling tears streaming down my cheeks. I agree, I said. I'll do everything to earn back your trust. I don't want to lose you, Michael. He reached out and gently touched my hand. I felt his touch conveying warmth and reassurance. I know it won't be easy, he said, looking into my eyes, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to give us a chance. I squeezed his hand, hardly believing what I was hearing. Thank you, Michael, I whispered. Thank you for giving us this chance. He smiled, and I saw that spark in his eyes that I had always loved. Don't thank me, he said. Let's just make sure it works. We both laughed, and I felt the air between us grow lighter. It was the first time in weeks that I felt there was a glimmer of light between us. In the following days, we made an effort to communicate more. Each evening we sat together, discussing our day, sharing thoughts and feelings. Michael started smiling again, his smiles more genuine, and his voice softer. One evening, as we sat on the terrace watching the sunset, Michael looked at me and said, Laura, I was thinking, why don't we go somewhere for the weekend? Just to change the scenery and remember why we loved each other so much. I smiled, feeling my heart fill with joy. That's a great idea, I replied. Where would you like to go? He shrugged. Anywhere, as long as it's away from everything that reminds us of the past. I nodded. Then let's go to the sea, I suggested. You've always loved the sea. Michael smiled. Yes, that's true. I think it will be wonderful. The next day, we headed to a small coastal town. Walks along the beach, the warm sand beneath our feet, the wind ruffling our hair. All of this marked the beginning of something new for us. We laughed, talked as if we had forgotten all the problems between us. In the evening, as we sat on the beach watching the stars, Michael suddenly turned to me and said, "I've realized something, Laura. Despite everything, I love you, and I don't want to lose you." I felt tears welling up again, but this time they were tears of joy. "I love you too, Michael," I whispered, "more than anything in the world." He pulled me to him and kissed me, and I felt all my fears and doubts dissolve in that kiss. We were starting our life anew, with renewed determination, and with faith that together we could overcome anything. And although there was still a lot of work ahead, many conversations, and much healing to be done, I knew that with Michael by my side, we had a chance at a new, better future.